Hey, hey, y'all, hey. I hope you can hear me okay. It's your good sister, Morgan Renee Myers, tuning in with another story time with Maura Mai. We are back in the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. We are in part 3 entitled Immortal in chapter 26. If you are not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, do yourself a favor and go do that. You can type in my name, which is Morgan Myers, M-Y-E-R-S, no extra E's. Or you can type in Storytime with Moremy, M-O-R-E-M-Y, and you'll see a bunch of reads from mostly black authors. This is the first book on my channel that I've read that's by a white author, but about a black flag. I just try to highlight, what they call it, BIPOC, black indigenous people of color. But anyways, let's hop right into it. We are in chapter 26 of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, Breach of Privacy. Despite her fears, Deborah didn't die on her 30th birthday. She just kept raising her kids, working various jobs as a barber, notary republic, chemical mixer at a cement plant, grocery store clerk, limousine driver. Okay? Shoot. Big deal. For the hustler. In 1980, 4 years after divorcing Cheetah, Deborah took her car to a mechanic named James Pulliam, who also worked at a local steel mill. They married in 1981. Okay, it's something about a man that fixes a car. It's something about a man that's good with his hands. So I understand why they got married. I understand it turns her on real nice to have to fix her whip. Because, she got all these kids. She got travel. So having a car and you could fix it, I need you to come home with me, sir. Come home with me. And he did. And he put a ring on it. They married in 1981 when Deborah was 31 and Pulliam was 46. Soon after, he got called by the Lord to moonlight as a preacher. Okay. Pulliam had some run-ins with the law before he was saved, but with him, Deborah felt safe. He rode around Baltimore on his Harley with a knife in his pocket and always had a pistol close. Okay, and he still was a man in the clothes. When he asked Deborah why he never met her mother, she laid the Rolling Stone article on the bed for him to read, and he said she should get a lawyer. She told him to mind his own business. Eventually, they opened up a little storefront church, and for a while, Deborah stopped worrying so much about her mother's sales. Zachariah was out of prison after only serving 7 of his 15-year sentence. He got himself certified to fix air conditioners and work on trucks, but he still wrestled with anger and drinking, and on the rare occasions when he found jobs, he lost them quickly. See, so, jails don't be rehabilitation centers all the time. Dang. He couldn't afford rent, so he slept most nights on a bench on Federal Hill in downtown Baltimore or on the steps of a church across the street from his father's house. Dave would sometimes look out his bedroom window and see his son lying on the concrete, but when he invited him in, Zachariah snarled and said the ground was better. Zachariah blamed his father for Henrietta's death, hated him for burying her in an unmarked grave, and never forgave him for leaving the children with Ethel. These are valid feelings. So earlier in the book, it was talking about how when their mama died, she was 30, and so she had 4, 5 kids by the time she passed away. And then he got this other woman that was not even his woman. She was married to some other guy. So her and her husband moved in with with Henrietta's husband and their kids, and she was mean to them. She was abusing them. I see why the young man upset. Your mama dead, your daddy ain't no count, your daddy your mama cousin. So, that's one thing. There's just a lot going on with this family. Lord have mercy. Alright. Zachariah blamed his father for Henrietta's death, hated him for burying her in an unmarked grave. And never forgave him for leaving the children with Ethel. They eventually stopped inviting him in, even though it sometimes meant walking past Zachariah sleeping on the sidewalk. At some point, Zachariah noticed an ad seeking volunteers for medical studies at Hopkins, and he realized he could become a research subject in exchange for a little money, a few meals, sometimes even a bed to sleep on. When he needed to buy eyeglasses, he let researchers infect him with malaria to study a new drug. Lord have mercy. He volunteered for research on alcoholism to pay for a new job recruiting program, then signed up for an AIDS study that would let him sleep in a bed for nearly a week. He quit when the researchers started talking about injections because he thought they'd infect him with AIDS. I'm glad you got some type of sense about you at some point on this journey. None of the doctors knew they were doing research on Henrietta Lacks's son because he changed his name. Zachariah and Deborah always figured that if Hopkins had found out he was a Lack, they wouldn't have let him leave. Yeah. The biggest payday any of the Lack's children ever saw came when Day and other workers got a settlement from a class action lawsuit against a boiler manufacturer over the damage done to their lungs from asbestos exposure at Bethlehem Steel. Okay, let me run that back. The biggest payday any of the Lack's children ever saw came when Day and other workers got a settlement from a class action lawsuit against a boiler manufacturer over the damage done to their lungs from asbestos exposure at Bethlehem Steel. They got a check for $12,000 and gave $2,000 to each of his children. That's nice. Deborah used hers to buy a small piece of land in Clover, smart gal, so she could someday move down to the country and live near her mother's grave. Sonny's rough period was only getting worse. Most of his income now came from a food stamp ring he ran out of Lawrence's convenience store, and soon he found himself in jail for narcotics trafficking. And it looked like Deborah's son Alfred was taking the same path as his uncles. By the age of 18, he'd already been arrested several times for minor offenses like breaking and entering. After bailing him out a few times, Deborah started leaving him in jail to teach him a lesson, saying, "You just stay there till your bill come down to where you can afford it." Later, when he joined the Marines and quickly went AWOL, Deborah tracked him down and made him turn himself into the military police. She hoped sometime in minimum security would convince him he never wanted to end up in a penitentiary. But things just got worse, with Alfred stealing, coming home on drugs, and eventually Deborah realized she couldn't do a thing about it. She told him, "The devil got you, boy. That stuff on you make you crazy. I don't know you, and I don't want you around here no more." Dang. That's tough as a parent when you have to, like, disown your child or distance yourself from them because you got to protect your peace and that of your family. And if they don't want better for themselves and you try to help, you can't make nobody do what they don't want to do. You got to let them, like, that's got to be tough. Man. I'm hopeful that she still be praying for the boy. That kind of was a little, oof, the devil got you, boy. Like, dang, that ain't something you want to say to your child. But if that's what you feel like it is, or what I think, sometimes you got to call a thing a thing. We done seen some people with some demons in us, some devilish ways, some extreme personalities. That boy got a demon on him. But I'm pretty sure she's praying for her son. In fact, she tracked him down and tried to make him do right. Alright, so in the midst of all this, someone told Deborah that as Henrietta's next of kin, she should request a copy of her mother's records from Hopkins to learn about her death. But Deborah didn't do it because she was afraid of what she might find out and how it might affect her. Then, in 1985, a university press published a book by Michael Gold, a reporter from Science 85 magazine, about Walter Nelson Reese's campaign to stop HELOC contamination. It was called A Conspiracy of Cells, One Woman's Immortal Legacy and the Medical Scandal It Caused. No one in the Lack family remembers how they learned about Gold's book, but when Deborah got a copy, she flipped through it as fast as she could, looking for her mother. She found the photo of Henrietta, hands on hips, and at the front of the book, and her name at the end of the first chapter. Then she read the passage out loud to herself, shaking with excitement. They were all the cells of an American who in her entire life had probably not been more than a few miles from her home in Baltimore, Maryland. Her name was Henrietta Lack. In the 10-page chapter that followed, Gold quoted extensively from her medical records, the blood spot in her underwear, the syphilis, her rapid decline. No one in Henrietta's family had ever seen those medical records, let alone giving anyone at Hopkins permission to release them to a journalist for publication in a book the whole world could read. Then, without warning, Deborah turned the pages of Gold's book and stumbled on the details of her mother's demise: excruciating pain, fever, and vomiting, poisons building in her blood, a doctor writing, discontinue all medication and treatments except analgesics, analgesics, analgesics. Okay, discontinue all medication and treatments except analgesics, and the wreckage of Henrietta's body during the autopsy. The dead woman's arms had been pulled up and back so that the pathologist could get at her chest. The body had been split down the middle and opened wide. Grayish-white tumor globules filled the corpse. It looked as if the inside of the body, was studded with pearls. Strings of them ran over the surfaces of the liver, diaphragm, intestine, appendix, rectum, and heart. Thick clusters were heaped on top of the ovaries and fallopian tubes. The bladder area was the worst, covered by a solid mass of cancerous tissue. And that's why I think they said was one of the causes of death is like her blood had got toxic because she couldn't use the bathroom properly. Like her urethra, I think, was blocked from the cancer. After reading that passage, Deborah fell apart. She spent days and nights crying, imagining the pain Henrietta must have been in. She couldn't close her eyes without seeing her mother's body split in half, arms askew and filled with tumors. She stopped sleeping, and soon she was angry at Hopkins and her brothers. She stayed up nights wondering who gave my mother medical records to a reporter. Lawrence and Zachariah thought Michael Gold must have been related to George Guy or some other doctor at Hopkins. How else could he have gotten their mother's records? When I called Michael Gold years later, he didn't remember who'd given him the records. He just said he had good long conversations with Victor McCusick and Howard Jones, and was pretty sure Jones had given him the photo of Henrietta, but he wasn't sure about the records. They were in somebody's desk drawer, he told me. I don't remember if it was Victor McCusick or Howard Jones. When I talked to Jones, he had no memory of Gold or his book and denied that either he or McCusick ever gave Henrietta's medical records to anyone. Liars. It wasn't illegal for a journalist to publish medical information given to him by a source, but doing so without contacting the subject's family to ask additional questions, verify information, and let them know such private information was being published could certainly have been considered questionable judgment. When I asked Gold whether he tried to speak to the Lack family, he said, I think I wrote some letters and made some calls, but the addresses and phone numbers never seemed to be current. And to be honest, the family wasn't really my focus. I just thought they might like some interesting color for the scientific story. Regardless, it was not standard practice for a doctor to hand a patient's medical record over to a reporter. Patient confidentiality has been an ethical tenet for centuries. The Hippocratic Oath, which most doctors take when graduating from medical school, says that being a physician requires the promise of confidentiality because without it, patients would never disclose the deeply personal information needed to make medical diagnoses. But, like the Nuremberg Code and the American Medical Association Code of Ethics, which clearly said that doctors should keep patient information confidential, the Hippocratic Oath wasn't law. Today, publishing medical records without permission could violate federal law. But in the early 80s, when someone gave Henrietta's medical records to Gold, there was no such law. Many states, more than 30 in fact, had passed laws protecting the confidentiality of a patient's medical records, but Maryland was not one of them. Several patients had successfully sued their doctors for privacy violations, including one whose medical records were released without her consent, and others whose doctors either published photographs or showed video of them publicly, all without consent. But those patients had one thing going for them that Henrietta didn't. They were alive, and the dead have no right to privacy, even if part of them is still alive. Ooh, that's a bar. All right, that's the end of chapter 26. Am I going to end here, or... I'll read chapter 27. So we're a little bit high. I'm going to get through this. Chapter 27, The Secret of Immortality. More than 30 years after Henrietta's death, research of HeLa cells finally helped uncover how her cancer started and why her cells never died. In 1984, a German virologist named Harald zur Hausen discovered a new strain of a sexually transmitted virus called human papilloma virus 18, HPV-18. He believed it was HPV-16, which he discovered a year earlier, caused cervical cancer. HeLa cells in his lab tested positive for the HPV-18 strain, but Zurhausen requested a sample of Henrietta's original biopsy from Hopkins so he could be sure her cells hadn't been contaminated with the virus in culture. The sample didn't just test positive. It showed that Henrietta had been infected with multiple copies of HPV-18, which turned out to be one of the most virulent strains of the virus. There are more than 100 strains of HPV in existence, 13 of which cause cervical, anal, oral, and penile cancer. Today, around 90% of all sexually active adults become infected with at least one strain during their lifetime. Throughout the 80s, during HeLa and other cells, scientists studied HPV infection and how it causes cancer. They learned that HPV inserts its DNA into the DNA of the host cell, where it produces proteins that lead to cancer. They also found that when they block the HPV DNA, cervical cancer cells stop being cancerous. These discoveries will help lead to an HPV vaccine and eventually earn Zurhausen a Nobel Prize. Research into HPV eventually uncovered how Henrietta's cancer started. HPV inserted its DNA into the long arm of her 11th chromosome and essentially turned off her P5 or her P.3 tumor suppressor gene. What scientists still haven't figured out is why this produced such monstrously virulent cells both in and out of Henrietta's body, especially since cervical cancer cells are some of the hardest of all cells to culture. When I talked to Howard Jones 50 years after he found the tumor on Henrietta's cervix, he was in his early 90s and had seen thousands of cervical cancer cases. But when I asked if he remembered Henrietta, he laughed. "I can never forget that tumor," he said, "because it was unlike anything I've ever seen." I talked to many scientists about HeLa, and none could explain why Henrietta's cells grew so powerfully when many others didn't even survive. Today, it's possible for scientists to immortalize cells by exposing them to certain viruses or chemicals, but very few cells have become immortal on their own, as Henrietta's did. Members of Henrietta's family have their own theories about why her cells grew so powerfully. Henrietta's sister Gladys never forgave her for moving to Baltimore and leaving their father behind for Gladys to care for as he aged. The way Gladys saw it, that cancer was the Lord's way of punishing Henrietta for leaving home. Gladys' son Gary believed all disease was the wrath of the Lord, punishment for Adam eating the apple from Eve. Cootie said it was the disease-causing spirits, and Henrietta's cousin Sadie never knew what to think. "Oh Lord," she told me once, "when I heard about them cells, I thought, could it have been something live got up in her, you know? It scared me because we used to go around together all the time. Henny and I ain't never been in that nasty water down in Turner Station like the other people. We didn't go to no beach or nothing like that, and we didn't ever go without no panties or anything. So I don't know how something got up inside Henny, but it did. Something came alive up in her. She died, and it just keep on living. Made me start thinking things, you know, like maybe something come out of space, dropped down, and she walked over it." Sadie laughed when she said this because she knew it sounded crazy, but that did went through my mind. She said, "I ain't lying. Everything just goes through your mind, you know? How else you going to explain them cells growing like they do?" Every decade has had its landmark moments in HeLa research, and the connection between HPV and cervical cancer was only one of several in the 80s. And the beginnings of the AIDS epidemic, at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, a group of researchers, including a molecular biologist named Richard Axel, who would go on to win a Nobel Prize, infected HeLa cells with HIV. Normally, HIV can infect only blood cells, but Axel had inserted a specific DNA sequence from a blood cell into HeLa cells, which made it possible for HIV to infect them as well. This allowed scientists to determine what was required for HIV to infect a cell, an important step toward understanding the virus and potentially stopping it. Axel's research caught the attention of Jeremy Rifkin, an author and activist who was deeply involved in a growing public debate over whether scientists should alter DNA. Rifkin and many others believed that any manipulation of DNA, even in a controlled laboratory setting, was dangerous because it might lead to genetic mutations and make it possible to engineer designer babies. Since there was no law limiting genetic engineering, Rifkin regularly sued to stop it using any existing laws that might apply. In 1987, he filed a lawsuit in federal court to halt Axel's research on the grounds that it violated the 1975 National Environment Policy Act because it had never been proven environmentally safe. It was widely known, Rifkin pointed out, that HeLa was an extraordinarily virulent and infectious line of cells that could contaminate other cultures. Once Axel infected HeLa cells with HIV, Rifkin said they could infect other cells and expose lab researchers around the world to HIV. I mean, I agree with him. Thus increasing the virus's host range and potentially leading to further hazardous dissemination of the AIDS virus genome. Axel responded to the suit by explaining that cells couldn't grow outside of tissue culture and that there was a world of difference between culture contamination and HIV infection. Science reported on the lawsuit, writing, "Even Rifkin admits that taken together these events sound more like the plot of a grade B horror movie than the normal run of affairs in the country's biomedical research laboratories." Eventually, the suit was dismissed. Axel went on using HeLa for HIV research, and Rifkin's horror film scenario didn't come true. Oh, I just gotta love donations. Thank you. All right. But in the meantime, two scientists had developed a theory about HeLa that sounded far more like science fiction than anything Rifkin had come up with. HeLa, they said, was no longer human. Cells change while growing in culture just as they change in human bodies. They're exposed to chemicals, sunlight, and different environments, all of which can cause DNA changes. Then they pass those changes on to each new generation of cells through cell division, a random process that produces even more changes. Like humans, they evolve. All of this happened to Henrietta cells once they were placed in culture. and they pass those changes on to their daughter cells, creating new facilities of HeLa cells that differ from one another in the same way that second, third, and fourth cousins differ, though they share a common ancestor. Okay, nice way to explain that. By the early 90s, the little sample of Henrietta's service that Mary had put into culture in the Guy lab had given rise to many tons of other cells, all still known as HeLa, but all slightly different from one another and from Henrietta. Because of this, Lee Van Valen, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago, wrote, "We here propose, in all seriousness, that HeLa cells have become a separate species." Van Valen explained this idea years later, saying HeLa cells are evolving separately from humans, and having a separate evolution is really what a species is all about. Since the species name HeLa was already taken by a type of crab, the researchers proposed that the new HeLa cell species should be called Helacyton gartleri, which combined HeLa with cyton, which is Greek for cell, and gartleri in honor of Stanley Gartler, who dropped the HeLa bomb 25 years earlier. No one challenged this idea, but no one acted on it either, so Henrietta cells remain classified as human. But even today, some scientists argue that it's factually incorrect to say that HeLa cells are related to Henrietta, since their DNA is no longer genetically identical to hers. Robert Stevenson, one of the researchers who devoted much of his career to straightening out the HeLa contamination mess, laughed when he heard that argument. "It's just ridiculous," he told me. "Scientists don't like to think of HeLa cells as being little bits of Henrietta because it's much easier to do science when you disassociate your materials from the people they come from. But if you could get a sample from Henrietta's body today and do DNA fingerprinting on it, her DNA will match the DNA in HeLa cells." Around the time Van Valen suggested HeLa was no longer human, researchers began exploring whether Henrietta cells might hold the key to human life extension, perhaps even immortality, and headlines once again claimed that scientists had found the fountain of youth. In the early 1900s, Carrel's chicken heart cells supposedly proved that all cells have the potential for immortality, but normal human cells, either in culture or in the human body, can't grow indefinitely like cancer cells. They divide only a finite number of times, then stop growing and begin to die. The number of times they can divide is a specific number called the Hayflick limit, after Leonard Hayflick, who published a paper in 1961 showing that normal cells could reach their limit when they've doubled about 50 times. After years of disbelief and argument from other scientists, Hayflick's paper on cell limits became one of the most widely cited in his field. It was an epiphany. Scientists have been trying for decades to grow immortal cell lines using normal cells instead of malignant ones, but it had never worked. They thought their technique was the problem, but when in fact it was simply that the lifespan of normal cells was pre-programmed. Only cells that had been transformed by a virus or genetic mutation had the potential to become immortal. Scientists knew from studying HeLa that cancer cells could divide indefinitely, and they speculated for years about whether cancer was caused by an error in the mechanism that made cells die when they reached their Hayflick limit. They also knew that there was a string of DNA at the end of each chromosome called a telomere, which shortened a tiny bit each time a cell divided, like time ticking off a clock. As normal cells go through life, their telomeres shorten with each division until they're almost gone. Then they stop dividing and begin to die. This process correlates with the age of a person. The older we are, the shorter our telomeres, and the fewer times our cells have left to divide before they die. By the early 90s, a scientist at Yale had used HeLa to discover that human cancer cells contain an enzyme called telomerase that rebuilds their telomeres. The presence of telomerase meant cells could keep regenerating their telomeres indefinitely. This explained the mechanics of HeLa's immortality. Telomerase constantly rewound the ticking clock at the end of Henrietta's chromosomes so they never grew old and never died. It was this immortality and the strength with which Henrietta cells grew that made it possible for HeLa to take over so many cultures. They simply outlived and outgrew any other cells they encountered. All right, that's the end of chapter 26 and 27. We'll pick up on chapter 28 another time. Thank y'all so much for tuning in. Hope you learned something new, and we'll pick up on this later. Peace, y'all. Have a good